Good morning. It's Brew Day at Wicklow Brewery, and it's a lovely sunny morning. Today we're going to brew a Dutch lager called Brand Up, or Up stands for Urtyp Pilsner, which means I think original Pilsner, if I remember rightly. And this is a beer from the south of Holland, the Limburg region near Maastricht. The brewery is called Brand. A lovely local regional brewery. Does some great beers, but Urtyp Pilsner is probably my favourite. I've travelled to Holland a lot over the years, and this Pilsner, German style Pilsner I suppose you'd call it, is very hoppy, and for a sort of non-normal lager drinker to drop on a hoppy beer is great, especially sort of 20 years ago before hops became trendy and so on. So it's a lovely, refreshing, crisp, golden lager with a lovely hoppy bitterness and aromatics from the hops as well. Just uses noble hops, but nevertheless really hoppy beer. And the recipe, or the basis for the recipe, is in this old book I've got, Brew Classic European Beers at Home. This is a rare breed book. It's been out of print for these many years, and if you ever see anybody selling off some old homebrew books and they've got this, snap it up, because it's just got a few different beers in that you wouldn't normally have in your other books, and this is one of them. It's got some Weiss beers in, some Belgian beers and things like that, as well as some British beers. It's Graham Wheeler book, and it's a little bit simpler than perhaps a modern homebrew recipe book would be, because it doesn't necessarily specify the yeast, and it says things like pale malt rather than which sort of malt and so on, but nevertheless it gives you a basis to develop recipes for some of these European beers. Now this beer is 100% pale malt. Actually, it says I'm using a lager malt, Munton's lager malt today. Right, we're looking for 9 EBCs of colour. We've probably just come a little bit under that with this particular malt I'm using, Munton's lager malt. But 37 units of bitterness. So, as I say, it's reasonably hoppy, and it's going to have an OG of about 1050, something like that, 1051, something like that. Now, at the moment, I've already mashed in this morning. Did overtrain a little bit last night, so that tea's the best thing really, isn't it? But I've already mashed in, and it's currently resting at 54 degrees in the mash. Now this is called a protein rest, and the idea of a protein rest is that you let long chain proteins get broken down a little bit, which happens best at this temperature of about 54, and when they break down, they will help with the beer with its body and its head retention, and they'll also, crucially for a lager, stop or reduce chill haze later on in the beer. So we're doing that now, but it's time to heat it up. Now, you've seen me probably go on before about decoction mashing for European lager type beers, and a lot of people don't like decoction mashing. Decoction mashing is where you take some of the mash out, stick it in a saucepan, boil it and stick it back in. I like decoction mashing for two reasons. Firstly, I think it certainly adds something to the flavour. When you heat it up to boiling in a saucepan, you're creating a little bit of Maillard reaction at the bottom of the pan. Maillard reaction is a little bit like when you read a recipe for cooking and it says brown the meat first, that kind of thing. That browning of the meat is the Maillard reaction. It's basically turning things on the outside of the food into sort of burnt sugary into burnt sugar type flavours, and it gives a caramelliness, it gives a body to the beer or the food, an unctuousness, if you like, that you wouldn't get if you didn't brown the meat or in this case boil the mash. Now That's the Maillard reaction, and that produces melanoidins. And the melanoidins have got all sorts of benefits, including antioxidants and good for Mr. Tumnus and everything. So it can't be bad. Now, the other thing about decoction mashing is that back in the day when I was just mashing in a bucket, and if my temperature was low or wrong, I'd basically have to do that to warm it up anyway. So to me, it's just like going back to the old days, take a bit out, warm it up, stick it back in to warm the whole mash up. And that's exactly what we're going to do right now. I'm going to take some mash out of here, stick it in these saucepans down here, and we're going to warm that up to boiling point, stick it back in, and that should lift the whole temperature of the mash. Eventually we're aiming for about 65, 66. And then after that, later for mash out, 74. Warming it up for mash out, of course, helps to clarify the wort, especially when you're recirculating it through its own self-filtering bed. So I'm going to do that right now, and well, I better have my tea first, and I'll just try and get back in shape. Oh dear, I can't even drink that. Right. I think I've probably said before my saucepans aren't big enough, but I'm using 2, so almost mitigates that. And today we're using Munton's lager malt. Could of course have used my favourite, which is Vehemen's floor malted Pilsner, but I've got a couple of sacks of lager malt in stock. I've got to use it for something. And since the recipe book only says pale malt, not even lager malt, perhaps I'm already stepping it up. Right, so we'll let those 2 pans come to the boil, and then we'll add them back in, raise the temperature of the mash, and get this show on the road. So I've checked the pH, it's 5.7, and so I've got 50 grams of lactic acid, which I'm going to add, so I better recirculate it a bit as well. The water salts have already gone in, and there is a bit of bicarb and a bit of chalk in the water salts, so I'm not surprised to see quite a high pH. It's fairly low mineral water salts today. We've gone for, it's actually Tricky's water profile for Smells Lagery, so I really trust it, because when I brewed that beer, it turns out really great. And it's fairly low in minerals, but it's in principle 2-to-1 sulfate to chloride ratio to just bring out the hops a little bit on this beer, which is probably ideal because it's quite a hoppy beer. So acid's just gone in, and I'll give that a stir and recheck the pH. Meantime, my pots are just, see down here? My pots are just starting to come to the boil. So we'll let them boil for a bit to make sure that all of it's boiled, and to get some of those Maillard reactions at the bottom. Right, so this one's been boiling for 10-15 minutes. And I'm going to need to pour it in. I'll just give it a stir so it's not frothing up. I don't want it dribbling on my hands. Probably shouldn't have filled it this full, actually. There we go. The other good thing about doing a decoction mash, I mean, if you're a brewer, when you mash in, you get lovely smells from the mash. I mean, in its simplest terms, it's like Horlicks, because it's, you know, pure malt, and the hot water sort of atomizes the aromas, and you can smell it in lovely smell. It's not what you normally smell at a brewery, because you know, if you live near one or something, it's normally the hops you can smell, but the smell of the malt is a bit more subtle, but it's delightful. Now, when you boil it like this, it releases different flavours, smells, and typically bready type flavours, smells. So this now smells like, I think I said it before about the fest beer, it's smelling like the inside of a white loaf, freshly baked. Break it open, steam comes off the flesh inside the bread, and it's the smell of that soft white bread centre. When I did the Märzen the other day, that's a darker beer. It's interesting because that smelled like wholemeal bread. So you do get different aromas according to what malts you use. Now, I would say that this is not as aromatic as the Weyermann's floor malted Pilsner, which is interesting, isn't it? That sort of floralness that I get from that one when you do decoction mash. Just getting only the white bread, and probably not as strong either. So that's interesting. Of course, modern malts like this one are what they call highly modified. A highly modified malt, which this probably is, now probably doesn't need a decoction mash or a rest at 54 or what have you, because it's been very successfully well malted. But it doesn't stop us enjoying this process and just trying to get that little bit more deliciousness out of the beer. It's doing Vorlauf now, recirculating the wort, and it's cleared up quite a bit. I wouldn't say it was crystal clear, but it's clear enough, I think, to start the transfer over to here. So now, I did say it was a hoppy beer, didn't I? And I've just stuck the hops in, 100% of them as first wort hops, and it's all this lot. So we've got Hallertau Mittelfrüh, Tettnanger, SARS, and I think that's it, yeah. So those three varieties, SARS, Mittelfrüh and Tettnang, and they've all gone in for the whole length of the boil. There's no late hops actually in this beer, so it's not so much going to be an aromatic beer as just nice firm bitterness and refreshing to drink because of it. So we're still sparging, and kettle's about probably a third full, so making good progress. By the way, the mash took 3.5 hours, because of the decoction mass. So yes, it did take a little bit longer than normal, but nevertheless I think it's worthwhile. Now the reason that I'm brewing this beer, Brand Up, is because my friend from Holland, Bob, is coming over soon. I don't actually know the date yet, but imminently. So I'm hoping I can get this ready in time. Maybe he can find a couple of bottles and bring them over and we can do a side-by-side tasting. Now, Brand, as I said, is a lovely regional brewery, but there is a catch, and the catch is Heineken. Heineken took over this brewery quite a few years ago, and of course that's a two-edged sword, because a little bit like, say, Beavertown in the UK, when Heineken takes over, what they do well is distribution. So you've suddenly, now you can see neck oil in almost, well, not every pub, but it's very widespread now in Britain, that you can buy neck oil, and I suppose that's great. But critics suggest that Heineken leads to over corporatization or watering down of the recipes, or whatever the kind of criticisms that are leveled at big corporate brewing businesses. And of course they can overlook beers and forget about beers. Now sadly, Urtyp Pilsner it seems to be a beer they're not that keen on. It's not very easy to find anymore. You don't often see it in the bars in south of Holland, and so I hope that they carry on with it. But I suppose to us homebrewers it doesn't matter, because we can simply brew it, can't we? So it's a little bit of another case of me finding a forgotten, overlooked, abandoned beer and restoring it back to life, although it is still available, but not very commonly. So I'm quite excited about that. I know Bob loves this beer, and I hope he can find some bottles and bring them over and we can have a taste. So it's always served in Holland in a beautiful, tall Pilsner glass with very thin glass, which in itself is quite nice, and it has a lovely frothing white head on it, and condensation running down the side of the glass. But when you drink it and you get that hoppy bite, it's a bit of a surprise when you're expecting a run-of-the-mill, if you like, European macro lager. It's nothing like that. It's got something about it, so that's why we're brewing it today. I can get it ready for Oktoberfest or not, I don't know, but it's pretty tight now. We're on, I think, something like the 9th of September, so we'll give it a go. And we're going to ferment this on W3470. We've been using for a lot of lagers. We used it for the Fest beer, we've used it for the Metz, and in fact the Metz is still in tank behind me. So what I'm intending to do is actually egg that, if I can find enough kegs, and wash them, and then we can put this wort straight onto the yeast cake in there. It's a bit of a cheat, but I'm pretty confident it'll work, and we know then that it's got a good load of healthy yeast from that former fermentation, and that's going to get this off to a good start. In order to keep up the speed, we'll ferment it at the top of the range that's recommended for that yeast, which is 18, I think, off the top of my head. So we'll probably set it at 17.5, but we'll put it under pressure. And putting it under pressure will suppress the esters that would otherwise be released by the yeast when it goes at a warmer temperature. So, you should be all right within the range stated on the yeast packet. But the other day I made some Landlord. I pitched it at 18. It was quite warm, and I decided that, like Landlord, like Timothy Taylor, I'd let it free rise overnight. So I turned off heating and cooling, and when I came in the morning it was 24.7, and I kept tasting it and thought, it's got something nasty in the woodshed about this, and it's just esters given off by the warm temperature. So it's amazing how just, especially at the beginning actually of fermentation, if it goes too hot, you can just literally ruin a beer. And I ended up just ditching it because I was just so grumps about it. So that's why we control temperature, fermentation, and why it's so important. And if you're a home brewer and you're not controlling the temperature of your fermentation yet, and it's something you're thinking of doing, then certainly I would say that it's absolutely worth it, because it gives you a massive step up in quality and consistency of your beer, and you'll definitely find that it's worthwhile. And of course it's useful to be able to cool it, cold crash it, to let it settle before you package it, and all the other things as well. But controlling it in the first 2 days of the fermentation seems to be quite crucial for stopping those nasty flavours coming out of the yeast. So in this case anyway, going back to this beer, we're going to keep it within the range, below 18, just below, but at the upper end, and we're going to put pressure on it, which will suppress the ester formation as well. And I think that will be a good formula for trying to get this beer through the system at quite a lick, so that hopefully we can drink it in time when Bob comes, and or both, maybe Oktoberfest. Just transferring the brand up into the fermenter now, and it's filling up nicely. We're pitching it straight onto the yeast cake from the Märzen, and which is the same yeast that I was going to use, 3470. And the remarkable thing is that my super duper long mash has been ultra efficient. I've just calculated the mash efficiency at 89.3%. So I've got wort here that's too strong, it's 1060 instead of 1051. So I'm going to have to back liquor it. So I'm getting it in the fermenter first. I'll recheck the gravity, and then add water as necessary from the HLT, which is at 80 degrees and therefore sanitized. So this is the last jug going in now. 20 litres we've liquored back, which I think's roughly 15%. So we've got a lovely full fermenter there, probably 150 litres or 145. So I've got the temperature control on 17.5. We're going to do it under pressure. I'll just put the lid on now and tuck it up, and we'll come back to it later. I'm just going to dump the cone on this brand up. You get the yeast out so that the beer can start conditioning a bit and settling in this tank. I'm not going to put my elaborate apparatus on this time. Go. I think I'll do that a couple of times to try and get all the yeast out over the next week or two. The brand up's ready for kegging, and we've started actually kegging it now into these corny kegs, and we've got the beer actually pretty clear already in the uni tank, which I'm quite pleased about. Not crystal clear, but it's pretty clear. Not showing much head retention at the moment, which is a slight cause of concern, although it is pretty typical of the style. And it tastes amazing, crisp, hoppy, dry, quite bitter. Everything we'd expect from this beer. So we'll get it into these kegs, get it in the cold room, and then in a few days or a week or so we'll be able to serve it. So let's pour a pint and find out what this beer's turned out like. It pours absolutely beautifully, nice and briskly from this tap, quite wide open, and as you can see, it's got pretty much the perfect amount of head, or will have when it's settled, and it's lovely golden colour and crystal clear, absolutely pin bright. So we've called the beer Urtyp Pilsner, not terribly imaginative this time, and we're given the badge a bit of an Oktoberfest theme. So we'll just admire it for a few more seconds. The beer came out at 5.7%, having had a good attenuation, which has helped to make the beer dry and crisp, which is in keeping with the German Pils style. So let's go over to the tasting room now and talk about how the beer tastes. Right, here is our brand up, or Urtyp Pilsner. And I'm absolutely thrilled with the clarity of that. Absolutely crystal clear. Can see my fingers and so on right through it. And it's got a beautiful white head, fairly loose in structure, and it's a reasonably thick head now, but to be honest, it doesn't stick around that long. But that's just pretty much typical of this style of a German Pils or Pilsner. They do tend to say Pils in Germany. Typical of the politeness, if you like. It's a kind of respectful way of differentiating it from Pilsner, as in Czech Pilsner. So, although this is made by a Dutch brewery, Limburg is the region in the south of Holland. It's right by the German border, really, and it's very much, I think, a German style pils. So the colour, just from lager malt, remember that there was no other malts in it, is pretty dark considering it's just lager malt, but it's a beautiful straw colour, and the head is going down a bit now, but it's a fluffy white head. So how does it smell? Yeah, it smells beautifully grassy in a quite a fresh, slightly herbal kind of a way. I've used the phrase Bavarian meadow for the fest beer, and that smells like somebody's just cutting grass on a slightly alpine steep hill with a scythe, and it's heating up in the sun, and it's the various flowers and so on are releasing aromatics. This is slightly different to that. This is got a bit of grassiness, bit of hedgerowiness, but it isn't quite as sort of floral as the fest beer came out at. Some similar hops. The fest beer was Hallertau Mittelfrüh, and this one's got a mixture of hops in it, of which that's one, of course, and the Saaz is another. So also on the nose, you can smell a little bit of honey and a bit of malty breadiness as well, sort of bread crust kind of a flavour. So let's try it for mouthfeel. I'd say it was medium light bodied. You can definitely feel the alcohol in there as well, the warmth from that, but it isn't coating your mouth for a long time. Right, so let's try and have a taste of this one. Beautiful carbonation, tingly on the front of your tongue, and then you've got quite a deep bitterness, long lasting. So it's 36, was it, IBUs in this? It's quite bitter for a lager. And I think it's absolutely beautiful to have that level of bitterness in a lager. It perhaps wouldn't be to everyone's taste, but for me, it brings this beer alive. It makes it vibrant, bitter, sort of pithy grapefruitiness lasts through after you've swallowed it. Taste continues to linger on. And typical for German pils is high attenuation, 83% attenuation, finishing gravity 1007 makes this 5.8%. So it's no wonder I can feel and taste the alcohol in there. The hops don't really hide it, they accentuate it. And the malt's there, but is it fully balanced? Probably not. I don't mind how this is structured and how it's coming together, but you probably not getting that balance of malt and hops like you do in the fast beer in a Helles or something like that, where you've got that nice bit of a bite from the hops, but you've also got honey sweetness, breadiness, and maltiness as well, balancing it out. This is a bit more muted on the malt side. And on the yeasty side, I think you're getting quite a crisp finish. Again, exactly what you're looking for in the German pils. So I'm really pleased with how that 3470 yeast has gone. I'm particularly pleased with that clarity. I have used Brausol in the keg, but nevertheless, that is pretty good. I did this on the 9th of September, and today it's the 14th of October. So 4 or 5 weeks later, and this is the result. So if you remember, we fermented this by pitching it onto the lees of another beer so that we could reuse the yeast. And then fermentation got going nice and vigorously, and we fermented it at 17.5 degrees, which is towards the top of the range, and we fermented it under pressure. So I'm really pleased to say that not only has it resulted in a beautiful clear beer within 4 or 5 weeks, but it's also crisp, which is exactly what we want, and clean. Yeah, I'm not getting any hint of any nasty flavors in there from. I'm not getting any hint of any nasty flavors in there from the hot fermentation. So I'm really pleased with that. What could we do differently next time? We could possibly change the yeasts a bit. I'm conscious of the fact I've used W3470 for a lot of these lagers, and possibly this might be a candidate for, is it S189, which suits a hoppier lager. Or we could play around with some other ones, but I promise that next lager I'll use a different yeast and we'll shake it up a bit. But we're really pleased with that. I think it's very drinkable, and it just adds to the portfolio now that we've got for Oktoberfest. So just to remind you, we've got the Fest beer, which is the super duper Helles, if you like. It's very fragrant, aromatic, honey sweetness balanced from breadiness in the malt. And then that's your main, if you like, modern day Oktoberfest beer. It's about 6% golden colour. Second beer we've got is the Märzen. The Märzen is a chestnut colour, and it's much more malt orientated, wholemeal bread kind of a taste, thick creamy head. It's going to suit those people that don't want a light beer and they do want something a bit more malty. Then thirdly, we've got the Schneiderweiss Tap 7, or Schneiderweiss as we called it, and that's going to be the ideal beer for somebody that prefers a Weiss beer. And remember that because we did that on the Union set, we pushed the yeast forward and we got loads of clove and banana going on with that beer. Then this one will give us a different kind of a lager. This is going to suit somebody that wants it crisp, hoppy, easy drinking. I'm afraid it's not weak. It's 5.8, was it? I said. But nevertheless, so we've got quite a portfolio there of strong beers, because they're all, I think 5.7 is the weakest of those four mentioned. And then we had the fifth one, which the video will be next week, is going to be a Zwickel or a Keller beer. So Keller beer is a lager that's usually hazy because it's fresh from the tank, and that's going to be the subject of next week's video. This Zwickel is more specifically an Austrian Keller beer, which we enjoyed last time we went over to Vienna. So tune into the next video for that. But in the meantime, I'm going to finish this one and probably grab another because it's absolutely delicious and it is just about frothing, although it isn't ale. But nevertheless, I'll bid you goodbye till next time and say frothing ale. Cheers.